Welcome to Dear Business Coach, the podcast. My name's Elizabeth, coming to you from the Walker Consulting Works studio. Find one thing to move your business forward today. Listen, follow, and subscribe on social media. Dear Business Coach Podcast. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. And don't forget Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. All it takes sometimes is one little thing to move your business forward today. I'm saying your name, Kaitlyn Dwyer.
That's correct.
Okay. And so, Kaitlyn, I've invited you on today because you are a recent graduate. You're a mythological scholar. So, Kaitlyn, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Kaitlyn Dwyer. I am presently a library assistant, but I am looking to get into writing for video.
And so writing for video games, is that a hard industry to get into from an academic perspective?
Absolutely. So as of right now, there are not a lot of universities that specifically have game writing programs. So a lot of getting into the industry from a university is sort of taking what degree programs and what majors, minors can I sort of put together to make the best portfolio for if I want to get into game writing, and then sort of building your portfolio around that, if that makes any sense. Full Sail University has one, and I'm not sure that there are any others that specify game writing.
Right. So do you have to curate that portfolio in order to be marketable? Can you blend what's marketable with your academic study?
So yes, you can. It's difficult. So for me, I had to take an independent study course in order to sort of have a class that put my love of game writing and making content for my portfolio into the same thing for my academics. I took a course. I was very fortunate. I had a teacher who was a classics professor who absolutely loves mythology, and she teaches using video games. Her name is Dr. Deborah Trusty. She's with the University of Iowa. And she was able to sort of work with me to make a portfolio sample for a mythologically based video game. So I have just like the first part of what would be a mythologically based video game that I can put into my portfolio. Other portfolio pieces that you would make, you kind of have to make on your own in your own time, just because there aren't classes and things where the work that you would make in that class would be applicable to that portfolio. So things like barks. I don't know if you've ever played any games, but if you're walking past a character and they just say something as you're walking past and it's triggered by you walking past, that's a bark. So a lot of things that you will be writing in video games are barks. So you need to have a bark sheet in your portfolio to sort of be considered to have like a well-rounded portfolio. But a lot of the things that you need to have in your portfolio, a lot of the things that you need to have to put on your resume, you kind of have to curate yourself and learn yourself. What do these companies want and need from me in order to be considered a good applicant?
Right. Did you know that when you were developing your major? Were you thinking about gaming?
Yes, I was. So I knew that I wanted to go into creative writing because I wanted to do game writing, but I also am interested in like novel writing and things like that. I just love writing. So I knew that that would be applicable to many things that I'm interested in. The minor that I got was actually it's actually a new thing. I did my degree online, and we weren't allowed to have minors until I actually like went to the university and was like, hey, I would really love to get this minor. And so now they're allowed to get minors. But I got my minor in ancient civilizations. And so that's where like my mythology background kind of comes from. Um, and I knew that that would be applicable to a certain extent because the story of classics, the stories of mythology, the psychology that goes into it is very intertwined with modern video games and a lot of modern adaptations. I don't know if you've ever heard of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. That's a big one that uses mythology and history. The most recent example, God of War Ragnarok, takes a lot of Norse mythology and Greek mythology and kind of brings them together. But it really, you build yourself into the candidate you want to be. So if you want to make a certain type of game, then you kind of build your portfolio to look appealing to the sort of people that want to make that kind of game. But it is very difficult. It's definitely a difficult thing. And a lot of it takes a lot of your own effort and your own sort of research and expertise.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine so. And a minute ago, you had shared with me that in creating your own work, it's highly collaborative. And so I wonder if when you're thinking about curating your portfolio for a potential employer, do you have a separate portfolio or do you do things with your professional portfolio that can make you allow you to be open to collaborators in the market that you might meet on your own for your own work?
Yes. A lot of different game developers, game writers, all these different things, they tend to have multiple pieces, like they'll have multiple bark sheets that they can kind of switch out in their portfolios, or they'll have multiple script segments that they can switch out so that wherever they're applying to, they can make it so that their portfolio sort of fits what they're looking for. If you're applying to a big AAA studio that is making games that are like for say The Sims, if you're making something for The Sims, you're going to have a different portfolio than if you're doing something that's like incredibly dialogue heavy, like Assassin's Creed. So it really is sort of shaping your portfolio to what you know about them as a company and their portfolio of games, if that makes any sense.
Yes, yes. It seems like you need a marketing assistant.
Yeah, it's very difficult and it takes a lot of research. The people who get into the games industry are incredibly passionate people. You can't get in unless you are incredibly passionate because it's not an easy industry to get into.
Okay.
You're not gonna do like 100 applications before you get a position. You're most likely you're gonna do 1,000 applications before you get in there.
Well,
It's very, very difficult, and especially right now, the climate in the games career industry is very bleak at the moment.
okay.
I'm hopeful that it will get better, but at the moment it's quite bleak. But it doesn't mean that anybody should stop trying, and you definitely should keep trying. But at the moment, it's very, very difficult, especially entry level, to get into the gaming industry.
Now, do you want to tell me about what I had read in your writing about choosing your storylines, your writing process, and how you're looking right now as a writer at adapting classical stories, if you will, the storylines that audiences are already familiar with, that they find engaging, but you as a writer putting your own unique spin on the storyline that makes it relevant to current audiences, but also doing that in a game. You say doing that in a game is like one of the coolest ways to interact with the audience and in your own process.
Absolutely. So mythology is very, very special in that it is applicable to a huge audience. Everybody knows mythology and everybody likes mythology. There's something inherently human and very like something that people can sort of see in themselves in mythological stories that spans audiences from very young to very old, which makes it something that video games would like to include in their like in their storylines and things, especially nowadays, with the inclusion of things like Hades and God of War Ragnarok and things like that. Mythology in video games is a unique challenge, but it's also very rewarding, in that you can sort of take these stories and shape them to give modern meaning and give sort of modern morality to these different things. I know God of War Ragnarok, without giving any spoilers, sort of takes Greek mythology and Norse mythology, and these two stories about like relationships between a father and son or a mother and son, and sort of bringing them together and taking what were kind of toxic storylines. They weren't toxic back then, but now we look at them through a lens of like, this is not how people are, like a family is supposed to treat each other. But sort of taking that and bringing them together and making it into something that is very human, very beautiful, very sort of psychologically compelling to players and viewers and things. You put yourself in this father's perspective of watching this son who is about to recreate the same mistakes that he made when he was younger, and him wanting to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And there's a lot of different mythologies that you can go into: Norse, Greek, Roman. My sort of specificity is Greco-Roman. I lean more towards Greek, but I do know a lot about the Roman mythology. And what's so wonderful about Greek mythology is that it is so vast and so interconnected. If you know the story of the Minotaur, then you will know the story of Daedalus and Icarus, and those stories are connected. The man Daedalus who created the labyrinth for the Minotaur is the same Daedalus who is Icarus's father, who helps him fly out of the tower that King Minos put them in. So it's very unique in that these are sorts of stories that they have like a long and interconnected sort of narrative that for video games, you need that. You need to have interconnectivity. You need to have compelling characters. You need to have characters that are flawed. And so a lot of the Greek mythology contains a lot of those qualities and can be very compelling to make into a game. One of the things that I am very passionate about is being able to adapt a story without completely changing the story. So there are certain aspects of myth that you have to make sure that you keep certain aspects of it to make sure that it is recognizable, but still be able to change certain aspects of it so that it is still like your own story. If you wanted to adapt the story of Medusa, that is a very hard for anyone, because Medusa, she went through a lot. She went through a lot, as we all know. She went through a lot and was punished for something that was not her fault by a female character. So when you're approaching that, if you wanted to adapt that into a game, number one, you have to think, how am I going to gamify this? Are you going to put someone in the shoes of Perseus, who kills her? Are you going to be approaching that from his perspective of, oh, I don't want to kill her, but I have to? Or are you going to approach it from the classic origin of, I am going to kill her to earn this kleos, this glory? And as you're approaching it, you have to think from the audience's perspective of, do they want to be in the perspective of a man who's going to kill this woman who did nothing wrong, from a modern lens? Are they going to want to approach it from the perspective of Medusa, where she doesn't have a lot of like ability to sort of make any choice for herself? Are you going to give them the freedom of choice in her shoes? Are you going to change the story that way? But then how are you going to continue to make it iconically the story of Medusa? So it's a story, and that's why there's a lot of collaboration that goes on when you're creating a game, and why you have more than one writer when you're creating a game, especially about mythology, is you have to sort of ask these questions and then collaborate to find the answers. It's very much like a Rubik's Cube, where you're wanting to get that balance between, you want it to be entertaining, you want it to be interesting, and you want it to be recognizable. And they're all things that have to come together in a very specific way for it to work. So definitely it's a difficult process. It's a labor of love, but it's something that I am definitely very passionate about. And I am always very excited to see when new games come out that have to do with mythology, because I definitely think as I'm playing through them, how the game developers sort of went through the process and how they made those decisions and things. And it's very interesting.
Be curious to see what it looks like when you're writing and then you're playing a game, and then you go back to your writing and well, what changes, and then you go back to the game and then what changes. So that must be a lot of fun.
It is. It's a lot of fun. I get a lot of inspiration from a lot of these games, especially the narratively driven ones. But it's definitely, there's no one right way to do it. And that's one of the things that's so wonderful about video games as a medium. They're not brand new, but they're newer. They're like the newest kind of medium in terms of artistic expression. And it gives you a lot of freedom, but it also gives you a lot of challenges, because you have to approach it from this very creative space of, how am I going to make this my own? How are we going to approach the technological aspects of it, which I am not an expert in. That's something that a lot of the people in the tech part of video game development have to face. But it's very cooperative. Everybody is so passionate about it. And it makes for a very exciting and rewarding experience to get to work on them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and what do we know about how the gaming industry is receiving women as writers? You're making choices about that context. What are we perceiving our audience is going to see in the context of?
So that's definitely a loaded question, because there's video
Sorry,
game.
it was
No. It's totally fine. It's just that the video game industry has a very varied audience. It's historically been sort of treated like a market for men. I don't know if you've ever played the earlier God of War games. They were definitely targeted towards a male audience. In a lot of the ways that they presented the characters, and like sort of had Kratos having these orgies in the background that people could go into, and things like that. And even the gaming industry itself has always sort of been catered towards men. If you watch some of the older GDC conferences and the Game Awards when they first came out, very male dominated, very geared towards men to watch it. But it's always been a space that women still want to play these games. Like, women have developed games since the inception of games. They started in colleges with men and women collaboratively working together. And to this day, there are still lots of women who are working in games, who are working as writers in games. There's a very big problem with certain male audiences feeling very entitled to games and the gaming industry, and feeling kind of betrayed when there are women writers who are giving their voices to the games and them feeling like, oh, like this should not be written this way because a woman wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's definitely, when you're going into the gaming industry, and even as a writer, you have to take that into consideration, because, and something that I have been noticing happening quite frequently, if you are a woman in the gaming industry and you have a social media presence, and you let it be known on that social media presence that you are in the gaming sphere, there is a tendency to get a lot of hate, a lot of hate comments. Have been death threats against certain people, who are writers or developers that are women in the gaming sphere. And when you're considering a career in gaming as a woman, you have to consider, am I going to be able to deal with that? Which isn't fair. And it's not the fault of the people who hire them, obviously. But it's a difficult situation to address, because you can't not, like, there's no real way to protect yourself from it other than not having a social media presence. And you kind of need a social media presence in order to stay connected with the rest of the gaming world. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. There's a lot of good, and there's definitely that dark side to it. I think the people who, and the women who get into gaming, are the ones who have to consider that and still say, I am passionate enough about this that I'm going to ignore that or push it aside, try to deal with it like through what pathways I have, and still choose that I still want to do games. And so it's definitely one of those things where you want to have more women in games, but it's difficult for a lot of women to make that choice, that they still want to go through the hurdles of getting into the industry, and then once you're in the industry, having to face that. So it's definitely one of those unfortunate situations. But I think that it's incredibly important that we have that diversity, and that we have their voices heard. And I think that a lot of women who become game writers are incredibly, incredibly strong and wonderful, people who just, their passion outweighs the risk. And I hope that it changes someday. I really do. I really hope. But that's how it is right now.
You know, you might have an opportunity for consulting, you might have an opportunity for advising.
Mm-hmm.
It's sooner than you think in the industry. You know, I always find it curious that here you are talking to me right now saying how games are starting with men and women collaborating. There's so many women who are passionate. There are so many women who are just really have a love of the art, and that's why they're here. So it's interesting to me that management or leadership at the top wouldn't look at that and say, well, there's money here, we have a market here. why
Yeah.
why would we ignore that market? So
Yeah,
I
they
I hope you
definitely.
can see some leaders, some women leaders that you can start collaborating with.
Yes, absolutely. And we definitely need a lot more women leaders in the game industry. It has, since video games started becoming commercialized, been very male dominated, in terms of who is the director, who is the main producer. Um, a lot of gaming companies, it's usually an older man, as it tends to be in a lot of different industries, but it usually is an older man, who tends to be white. It's not always, but tends to be white, older man. Um, but thankfully, we're seeing a little bit of that starting to change, here and there at a couple of different companies. We're seeing a lot more, female indie developers, that are coming out with their own games, where they can sort of give their own voice without having to go to a AAA company and, go through having to be underneath, sort of domineering male figures. There's definitely also issues in the AAA gaming industry with, like, sexism and all in the office. I know there was a really big controversy like within the last couple of years with Blizzard, which is the company that did like Overwatch. If you've ever heard of that game, they had a controversy with a lot of sexism and things going on in their office. But I think part of changing that is facing that, and sort of coming forward with it. And especially for people who are in positions in like HR and stuff, not ignoring that and not like giving them a pass so that they don't have to fire certain people. Like it has to actually be dealt with.
Right.
And hopefully we're going to see a lot more women getting into those positions of power, because there are, as the gaming industry moves forward and as more women move into the gaming industry, more of them are learning more and gaining more expertise, and will be able to sort of have the experience and the drive to get into those positions of power, where they don't have to be competing on a level that's uneven. There's not so much of a glass ceiling eventually.
You have a project going on right now, don't you, at the Roanoke County Public Library System?
Yeah, absolutely. I work for the Bent Mountain Library, and at the moment I'm working on some Greco-Roman mythology programs. Right now, the one I'm working on is geared sort of towards adults, and it's just sort of getting them into mythology. I'm hoping to bring some video games into play with that. I told you about how my teacher, Dr. Trusty, uses Assassin's Creed Odyssey to teach, and it is a great tool. They have what's called Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I think it's Discovery Tour is what it's called, where you don't have to play the game, but you go in and they have where you can sort of tour around recreations of the different cities and learn about the people who are in the cities and how they reconstructed the Parthenon and different things like that. And it really brings people of all generations in to be able to learn from games in a way that is very interactive. And I think interactivity is a great way for people to learn. It's the best way for people to learn because it actually sticks with you. Doing something physical and having your mind focused on something really like it makes it much more memorable. And so I'm very glad that that's a resource, but I'm for the Bent Mountain Library, I'm hoping to incorporate that. And I'm definitely going to be incorporating a lot of the different mythological studies and things that I have gained from my minor. And I'm very, very excited about it.
Right. So you have firsthand experience on the educational process and
Yeah,
as a tool. So I think that sounds to me like a whole different market, right? And part of your passion, right? If I'm not a gamer, you, as I said earlier, you for the most part could be speaking a foreign language to me, but I absolutely connect with your the passion and the artistry to bring a story to an audience, and to where does that audience experience the psychological process that's so enjoyable about actually being immersed in a story. And so that's what makes the game, that's why people love games.
absolutely.
So right, so if so as an academic, right, you might have some things to say to on a Venn diagram, those people in the middle who are like, well, I don't know, I see the value of in using games for educational purposes, but also, what are we talking about over here? God of War. Yeah, my kid's in his bedroom for 10 hours. So like there, somewhere in the market, you have a voice as an academic, to talk about the value, what games do for us and as humans, what do games do for us as humans?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I went into a lot with my minor was the psychology of mythology and why it speaks to us on such a deep level, and how feeling like part of the story really can form connections in your brain that um, you have to be able to identify in order for something to really connect with you. And so it's definitely incredibly interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I love working at the library so much. One of the reasons why I've been looking into library positions for my full time is because it's definitely a position where you can bring that academic and that creative spirit together for a lot of programs and for a lot of different what do they call conferences, like the VLA. I've applied to do a program there about bringing video games into the library system, and why video games are important to have as a medium and to preserve like older titles and things as consoles die out. And it's definitely something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad that I'm able to connect my passion for video games with my passion for academia and library science and things. So it's definitely it's really wonderful to be able to bring those sorts of things together and still make a living.
Right. Well, you're creating value for people.
So I am on LinkedIn, Kaitlyn Dwyer. I'm on Twitter. It's at Kaitlyn_A_Dwyer. And I would love to hear from anybody who has any questions or any concerns. I'm always here to talk.
Okay, well, we'll post your social in the show notes. And wow, I learned a whole lot today. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad. Thank you for inviting me. I had a great time.
We'll talk again really soon, I hope. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today. My name's Elizabeth, coming to you from the Walker Consulting Work Studio in Floyd, Virginia. This has been an episode of Dear Business Coach.